Hello, and welcome back to Unleaderly, the podcast where we talk about leadership and everything that relates to it, which is almost anything. My name is Barbara Iverson, and I'm your host. Today, we are going to talk a bit about the name of this podcast. So of course, the name is Unleaderly, with the un in brackets, in parentheses. So where did this come from? Well, I started thinking about this name. It came to mind when I started writing a book about leadership. And my starting place was really women in leadership. The book is not yet published, so don't go looking for it. You won't find it. But it's something that I've had in mind for quite some time. And it came out of conversations with young women who were emerging into leadership spaces. One of those spaces was the tech university that I worked at here in Berlin, where I was leading the interpersonal skills team and finding that there were a number of young women who had a lot of questions about leadership. They were leading teams, they were leading product teams, they were in positions where they wanted to grow and develop, but they were struggling with the materials that they were finding that were meant to be helping them, but in fact weren't. And based on that, I decided that I could step in and provide a place to look into the questions that they had on the topics that they were really interested in. So I developed a module called Leadership, where I spoke about it a bit in the first podcast, where students had to examine different leadership aspects of themselves and kind of analyze other people. And they needed to consider things like the intersection of power, authority, influence, the differences between leadership and management. Like, I really wanted them wrestling with a lot of different topics. And one thing I wasn't doing is teaching leadership styles. And I think some people were actually quite confused about this, because when you start having conversations about leadership, often the first thing people turn to, and if you Google it, this is what you will find: a list of different styles. And I'm not sure exactly who came up with all of them, but I know that they became very popular, especially in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. In any conversations about leadership, you would find people specifically talking about named styles. So things like autocratic or authoritarian, a very strong central leader, or democratic/authoritative, which was a much more collaborative approach. You also had laissez-faire, very hands-off, transformational, which I think is quite clear, transactional, meaning like rewards and punishments, servant leaders, people who were much more concerned with serving their teams, and then also coaches, coaching leaders. So people who are more interested in developing skills of their people. And there's more, and they're all defined pretty similarly, but those are leadership styles. And I felt, as the one who'd put the module together, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So I didn't really want to have workshops about what these leadership styles were. I wanted students to become familiar with them. I wanted them to know what the thinking was out there. But like I said, I didn't need to have a lot of input from my side, because there's already so much that's been written about this. There's plenty of books out there, many of them written, again, in the 90s, early 2000s, many of them written by older straight white men, about how to identify the leadership styles, what they look like in practice, how to develop the skills that might help you become a certain type of leader, and also how to work with a leader who's displaying that trait. But I also wasn't interested in sort of cementing these concepts in their minds, because I don't always find it helpful. Why is that? Well, because most people do not fall into one category of leader. just like most people, really all people, are not 100% one thing. No one is 100% nice all the time, every situation. And many people who might be mean or angry people, it doesn't mean that they are terrible in all parts of their lives. The people have different aspects, and you could be a war criminal and also a caring grandfather. Let's think of it in those terms. These leadership styles, I also didn't want anybody thinking that they had to choose one style or one way of leading and then dig in their heels and become that forever and ever. Because to me, it's just not reasonable. So because no one is all one thing and nobody stays in one mode for their entire career of leading, or, if you're leading a team for 5 years, managing a team, like you won't be the same person every moment of those 5 years. It's kind of a trap in some ways to have these leadership styles. They're helpful in the sense of naming different approaches that you could use at different times. And when a more authoritarian perspective or behavior might be more helpful for a team than a coaching. This is all reasonable. I'm not saying that these leadership styles are worthless. They're not. However, I think they really have drawbacks. And one of the drawbacks is when you cannot really see your own natural style or approach to leadership or management in them. And then they become a bit frustrating. Particularly in the startup environment, people talk about vision being an incredibly important leadership quality. I really don't agree with that. And I think there's going to be a bunch of people who really disagree with me. And you know what? Cool, great, disagree with me. And we could talk about it. We could talk about it endlessly. But to me and my experience, I have worked with and for people who are extraordinary visionaries. They see a future that people get excited about and want to follow and stand up or raise their hands and say, I want to be part of what you are describing. And at the same time, those visionaries have no idea what on the ground management or like day-to-day leadership looks like. They don't know how to lead a company. They don't know how to lead a team. They don't know how to get the best out of the people who are working for them. They don't know how to identify people's strengths. They don't know how to see them. They don't know how to talk with them in a way that actually encourages movement and steps forward. They have a vision. They like to talk about their vision, and that's about as far as they can go. So they need people around them who actually can do the other work, because of course, if they didn't, nothing would ever happen. But because vision is considered to be such an important thing for specifically founders in the startup scene, and working at a tech university in Berlin, we were very entrenched in the startup scene. So you had these young women who were leading teams and saying, I am leading this project, this product development. I'm leading this group of people toward a goal, but I don't think of myself as a visionary. I'm not trying to project some big vision of where we're going. I just want to build something, and I want to help people work together to build it. What a lot of these women were saying was that they didn't find themselves to be leaders. They didn't consider themselves to fall into those categories that people kept talking about as someone who leads. Also, what you'd find was because there was so many young men who were coming out of places of privilege, and they were incredibly confident. And that was another thing that they were bringing with them to the table, full confidence. Even when they were totally mediocre or even subpar. They had the confidence. I mean, people talk about this. Oh, to have the confidence of a mediocre white man. Yes. And this was, again, what these women were seeing. These men that they knew they could run circles around, who had such confidence and were leading people, even if they were leading people down the wrong path. It didn't matter. They were leading with strength and confidence, and these women were looking at them going, well, I'm not that. So I guess I'm not a strong visionary, and I guess I'm not confident. What came to my mind after lots of conversations, and actually it came to me well after I no longer worked in that job. But when I think back to those conversations and with other women moving forward in other career placements and other jobs that I had, I found this to be consistent, that women often looked at themselves and judged themselves to a different standard than, or they were, no, that's wrong. They were not judging themselves to a different standard. They were trying to judge themselves with the standard of the men around them, and they were finding themselves lacking. And what I want to say about this is that many of these leadership styles, it's based on men writing about other male leaders. It is not women or people of color or people who are neurodiverse or people who are from the queer community. It's not them writing about their own leaders, people who look and sound and talk and behave the way they do. Instead, most of this has been about people talking about white male leaders. Not that there's anything wrong with white male leaders. There really isn't. But women approach leadership and approach interactions with other humans quite differently than men tend to. And this is where I started thinking, okay, this approach that I'm seeing, women need to be able to find spaces where they can think about themselves as leaders without having the constraints of these expectations that exist because white men have or had them. So I was thinking, okay, if this is where we are, then if I reflect the attitude of these women, then they don't see themselves as leaders. And I thought of the word, first I thought of leaderly, like they're not leaderly. And then of course that led me to unleaderly. So as much as I love the word unleaderly with the brackets and the concept that I've given it to mean that it's someone who doesn't fit the typical mold of a leader. It's someone who looks different, who has leadership qualities, but maybe not necessarily the most expected ones. On the other hand, I also realize that if you ask someone, if you hear the word unleaderly, what does that mean to you? They might come up with something completely different. I asked this to a girlfriend and she said, I think if someone's being unleaderly, they're being a really bad leader. They're making decisions that are not good for their team or for themselves or the people that they're leading. So the concept of unleaderly is multidimensional. It doesn't just mean one thing. And I'm okay with that. I think that some people will look at the name of this podcast and have their own idea, and maybe that will lead them to listen to it. If someone thinks, hey, this is a podcast about people who are terrible leaders and what they've done. Hey, I've done a workshop called Shitty Leaders and How to Learn from Them. And that has been a space that a lot of people are attracted to because almost everyone has experienced a bad leader. So if that's what's brought you to this podcast, welcome. Hi, I'm glad you're here. If you're here because you, like me, are not what people might expect of a stereotypical leader, you're also welcome. I hope that that's what this podcast is moving toward, that we explore together what it looks like to not fit into the traditional molds of leadership and maybe to approach it differently. But sometimes we are going to fit into the traditional molds, and we are going to recognize traditional mindsets and expectations of leaders at the same time. Like it's all possible. The other part, there's this tiny little piece of me that also finds unleaderly to take me back to the word ladylike or unladylike. And I wonder if any of the rest of you who've seen the name or heard me say it, if that word has also come to mind. I think it's entirely possible. I'm super curious if that's true. But ladylike was something that my dad tried very hard to instill in me as a young girl. He wanted me to be ladylike. And my dad was a wonderful man and a wonderful father. I'm not really sure that this was even a weakness or something negative on his side. He was doing the best he could. But to him, he had these ideas of being ladylike and what that meant, and he wanted me to be ladylike. And I think the reason he wanted it was because he felt it would be my best possible chance at life. Now remember, this was in the 70s, and women had had freedoms and opportunities for quite a short time. The world had changed during my dad's lifetime in what women were able to achieve without the backing specifically of men, specifically of like husbands or fathers. He had his desires for me to be ladylike. What did that look like? Well, it was ladylike in how I talked, how I dressed, how I behaved. He often operated out of wanting me to fit into this mold. And I'm happy to say that I don't consider myself to be ladylike at this point in my life. My dad is not with us any longer, but I think he would agree that who I am, and if I say that I'm not ladylike, and he might agree that I'm not, I don't think he would think it was a bad thing either. Again, he was doing the best he could, and that was what he was thinking of. It was in my best interest. But what did that look like? Being outspoken, having an opinion, and being able to communicate it and behave and act on it. Being bossy. I talked about this in the last episode, that as a child, specifically, I was bossy. I'm bossy now, but in a different way. But then bossy was a super negative word, and we think about it differently today than we did back then. But I was bossy, and today I consider that a good thing, especially in a young woman, but also in any woman. I think it's also unladylike to speak uncomfortable truths. It's more ladylike to conform, to be more like maybe wallpaper, be something pretty on someone's arm, to be there as decoration, perhaps, to be kind, to be gentle, to be caring. These are all positive things for sure. But speaking uncomfortable truths and pressing back on some of those, what does being kind look like? That can be considered quite unladylike. And also demanding your fair share, demanding equity, demanding that people who are at a disadvantage have a voice, to make sure that all voices are present around the table. I think this can be considered quite unladylike, because it's ruffling things. It's challenging the status quo. It's making some people uncomfortable. Well, sure. Yeah, the ones who've made it inequitable or been exclusive or kept some of the voices away from the table, kept people away from that seat where they could have a voice or a vote or a chance to speak up for themselves and other people like them. Like, yeah, I'm fine with that being unladylike. But I think it's necessary, and I want to be that person. I want to be that person standing up and saying, I'm not okay with this. So unleaderly, for me, encapsulates both not fitting in to leadership norms, maybe old-fashioned leadership norms or traditional leadership norms, but also not being ladylike in the process. That's where the name comes from. That's where the intention comes from. And I hope some of that resonates with you in some way, that you can see yourself in those descriptions, that you might say, finally, someone is thinking about this a little bit differently than we always have. Or finally, someone is saying the things that I wish I'd heard as a younger person. Or, wow, I really wish that someone was saying this. Good. Because I'm going to try to. I'm going to try to say it as I see it. Not to make people uncomfortable for the sake of making them uncomfortable. I think we need to talk about some things in a different way because all voices have not been present in the conversation. And that will make people uncomfortable. And I think that is just fine. As we wrap up today, I want you to think about, what did you think of when you saw the name Unleaderly? Specifically with the un in brackets, what went through your mind? Was it in the explanations that I offered, or the way that I was thinking, or the way that my girlfriend was thinking? Where did you find yourself in that? I want to thank you for joining me today. And as always, thank you to Lilia Keys for the intro and outro music. And I hope you have a great day.